is a traditional Gaelic festival that marks the end of summer and the beginning of winter. While it's known as a Celtic New Year, this festival is also dedicated to the dead and ancestors, as the barrier between the living and the dead is non existent during this time. It is traditionally held on the night of October 31st to November 1st. The term Samhain originates from the Old Irish word Samhain or Samhain, and it derives from an ancient Celtic tradition. By breaking down the word, Sam from the Proto-Indo-European Samos, it means summer, and Wen means end. However, it's been pointed out that the Celtic summer officially ends in August with the Sabbat of Lunasa, which marks the end of autumn and the harvest season. Then there is another name origin that comes from the Proto-Celtic term Samoni, which means assembly, or the Proto-Indo-European Semo, which means together. Considering that Samhain takes place during the time the living and the dead gather together, there is the possibility that Samhain derives from this term. There are three widely spread notions about Samhain. Firstly, it's a misconception that Samhain is a Celtic fire festival. Secondly, it's confusion of whether Samhain is considered to be the Celtic New Year. Both of these ideas were popularized by John Rites and James Fraser. The first misconception that Samhain is a fire festival might come from the fire festival held at Clogda on the eve of Samhain. Clogda, now commonly known as Ward Hill or Hill of Ward, is located in County Meath, Ireland. This festival, which I will refer to as a tradition for simplicity's sake, which could be the ancient Celtic tradition I mentioned above, was partly spiritual and part survival. While this was a time that saw a harvest gathering, this was also considered to be the beginning of winter and the darker half of the year. This was a time where the veil between the living and the dead was the thinnest, allowing spirits and other supernatural creatures to cross over. Druid priests chose this particular hill as they believed that that was the point in which the human world and the other world were closer together. This tradition saw families leaving their hearths to burn while they gathered their harvest. After they gathered their harvest, they would join the Druid priests as they lit a wheel on fire. The fire was typically started with friction, as it was believed that a forest fire would ward off illnesses, the plague, or bewitching from the livestock. Then the old or weak cattle would be sacrificed and prayers were said. Afterwards, families would take part of the fire back to their homes, where they would then relight their hearths after dousing the old one if it didn't extinguish by themselves. This was done to ward off unwelcome spirits. The tradition of Clogda has connections to the Irish goddess Clogda, for which the hill is named after. Clogda is a sun goddess in Irish mythology, although she is considered to be a goddess of death, rebirth, and lightning, as her name means earth spear, a word we have come to associate with lightning. Clogda is also known as being a form of the triple goddess. Clogda's story originates from the Furblogs, the fourth group of people to settle in Ireland according to Irish mythology. This evidence comes from the story The Siege of Knocklong, about High King Cormac Mac Art, in which her father is mentioned. Her story is an important but forgotten piece of history. Clogda was the daughter of Chief Druid Mogruth of Munster, although some stories have said he was a god due to his powers. His name means devotee of the will, which is important for Clogda and the tradition followed. It's said that the three sons of Simon Magus raped her aunt Embolic, and she later died on her hill on Samhain night, giving birth. However, her story was rewritten by Christian scribes based on the tale of John the Baptist, and so this version is not to be believed. Other versions of her story have compared her with other tragic heroines of Irish mythology, such as Etain and Macha in the Ulster cycle. Whatever her story, Clogda did indeed die, giving birth to her three sons on her hill on the night of Samhain. This is where her association with death, rebirth, and her triple goddess status comes from. After she died, her followers raised the hill around her body, and fires were built to honor her. It's also said that her father built a fire temple for her on the hill. Since then, every night of Samhain, a bonfire was lit on the Hill of Ward to honor the goddess and bring in Samhain the following day. So, the fires lit on October 31st do not necessarily belong to the Samhain festivities, but rather they have become a part of Samhain due to Clogda. The second notion is that Samhain is the Celtic New Year. John Rees, the originator of the claim, stated in his book Celtic Folklore, Welsh and Manx, the Samhain was the start of the New Year, citing a note in John Kelly's Manx English Dictionary which states that on the Isle of the Man, the Manx mummers celebrated the New Year on November 1st. He said the Manx also called the night of October 31st Haugana, which is a Scottish term derived from either French, Gaelic, or Norse roots. The Manx first had Celtic influence during the Iron Age, in which many Celtic religious beliefs began to take root, including that of Samhain. Norse influence reached the island in the 8th century and eventually dominated the island. It's important to note that the Norse celebrated Yule, which lasted 12 days beginning on the winter solstice and continued until their new year. In the end, Huguna is the combination of the winter solstice practices from the Norse and Samhain practices from the Gaels. So it's inferred that the Manx simply incorporated the term Haguna into the practices of Samhain due to the similar practices at both festivals. There's been other evidence that Samhain was considered to be the Celtic New Year in the form of the tale The Wooing of Amir, where it acknowledges that Samhain is the first festival of the year. There's also the Feast of Tara, which takes place at Samhain, being recognized as the first of the great assemblies. Yet, the tale The Settling of Manor of Tara states the assembly was held every 3 years and lasted 7 days and 7 nights, 3 days before Samhain and 3 days after. Then, in the tale Extra Cormac, it states that the Feast of Tara takes place every 7th Samhain, but none of the sources I have found has ever stated that it took place annually. I imagine that if Samhain were the Celtic New Year, the assemblies would take place annually, just as the assembly at Tale 10 did. Like the Feast of Tara, the assembly of Tale 10 coincided with Lunasa, and similarly to Samhain, the dead were centered. The assembly at Tale 10 originated from the funeral games honoring the goddess Tale 2. Additionally, there are sources which say Beltane assembly at Ishnog coming first. There is also the continuous mention of summer coming before winter, hinting that the Celts may have used summer to note the start of the new year rather than the winter. As the evidence suggests, there is no definitive answer, mainly because the traditional Samhain practices were all written down centuries after by Christian scribes. We can only infer based on the text we have. In short, it's simply up to the practitioner. Finally, the third notion is that Samhain is a festival for the dead. Despite the fact that the dead and ancestors are honored during this time, there are no sources which indicate that this festival was specifically for the dead. Although the veil between the human world and the other world is the thinnest, thus allowing the dead to cross over, I must note that it was not just the dead that made their way to the living. The other world in Irish or Celtic mythology includes the dead and various supernatural creatures. There are actually a few rituals that used to be performed in order to appease these supernatural spirits and creatures to ensure the people and livestock lived throughout the winter. Funny enough, this was a theory that was put forth by James Fraser, and its evidence, the Church and All Saints' Day. There are 2 reasons why the Church created this holiday. One was to honor the dead Christians at the hands of pagan emperors, and 2, a theory that it was created to replace the Roman festival of the dead, Limeralia. Whatever the reason, there was no evidence that it was created to specifically replace Samhain, or as Fraser hypothesized, Christianize it. How Samhain became associated with the dead specifically does have to do with the start of All Souls' Day, which is a day where Christians honor their dead family members and friends. That is not to say that the Celts didn't originally honor their dead. As dead relatives made their way back to their families, a place would be set for them at the dinner table. They would be able to reunite with their loved ones on this one night. And generally, spirits were welcome, although many were not, and there would be protections families could use to protect their household from unwelcome guests. It seems that a combination of Samhain and Christian practices gave us many traditions we see today. Samhain, according to Irish mythology, was a time when the doorways to the other world were open, allowing supernatural beings such as fairies and the souls of the dead to come into our world. One such tale is the Adventures of Nera, in which on one Samhain night, hero Nera encounters a corpse during a challenge issued by the king for the king's gold-hilted sword. The task was that each challenger must go to the gallows where a man was hung and tie a twig around the man's ankles. Others had tried but had given up when they were harassed by spirits. While Nera was able to complete the challenge, the corpse tricked Nera by asking for water, and Nera agreed, carrying him on his back. When Nera brought him to various houses, the first 2 repelled the corpse with fire and water, but the last did not, and the corpse was able to kill the household by spitting water on them. Nero then returned the corpse back to the gallows, and went back to the court but found it on fire and the inhabitants decapitated. It is revealed at the end of the story that everything Nero witnessed was a vision of the future, and it was that the Sede people, which were the fairies of Irish mythology, had burnt the court. All these events were going to happen on the next Samhain night unless he warned the king to prepare for battle. Another popular myth is the story of Fionn MacLeod, who defeats the fire breather Eileen, the Burner, one of the Tuatha De Danann, a supernatural race in Irish mythology who dwell in the otherworld but interact with the human world, who emerges from the underworld every Samhain to destroy the Hall of Tara after lulling everyone to sleep with the music. Fionn, the hero of the story, manages to stay awake by inhaling poison from his spear and slays Eileen when he arrives. The king rewarded Fionn by making him the leader of the Fianna. Other tales include the epic Irish poem Tam Boy Cuileanna, the second battle of Moytura, the second text of the Cath Moytura, and the tale of Aidina and the Tokmug Aidina. Some historic customs of Samhain are livestock. Samhain was a time to take the stock of cattle and food supplies from the harvest. Cattle were taken to winter pastures. It is also a time to choose which animals get slaughtered for sacrifice, which is a custom that is still followed by most farmers today. Bonfires. Like Beltane, bonfires hold significant Samhain because it was used as protection against dark spirits and other evil creatures. Like Beltane, cattle are driven between two bonfires as a way to protect them from evil and sickness, and then the bones of the slaughtered cattle were cast into the bonfire. After the celebrations were over, people would take torches with fire from the bonfire and relight their hearth fire. Divination. There were many types of divination used during this time. One in particular involved the use of bonfires. Each person was said to have had a stone that represented them, and each person would place their stone in a circle around the bonfire. When morning came, if the stone was mislaid or moved, it is said that the person represented by that stone would not live out the rest of the year. This is also a Welsh tradition as well. Dumb Summer. A dumb summer is when one holds a gathering for the deceased loved ones and ancestors or other ghosts. The eating only began once the dead were invited, and during invitations, talking was not common. Afterward, the dead were updated on yearly news, and children were allowed to play games, etc. The dumb supper is not part of the original Samhain traditions, and it appeared sometime during the 5th century.